Aotearoa, kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody to MB's Building Products Information Requirements webinar. We still have quite a few people joining, so I thought we'd just get started with a little bit of housekeeping. We've got quite a lot to cover today, and I know that many of you have questions that you want to make sure get answered, so we will just get underway now. So as I said, just a few housekeeping things. My name is Amy Moorhead. I'm the manager of the building policy team here at MB. And with me presenting today, I have Connor, who's a senior advisor in our design and implementation team. And I've also got Lisa, who's a senior regulatory specialist in the building system assurance team. And we're going to be presenting today on the building product information requirements, which are coming into force on the 11th of December this year. Now, what we're going to be talking to you about today is largely contained in the guidance document that we have already released. So somebody is going to pop a link to that guidance document in the chat. If you want to click on that link, and we'll be referring to various parts of that guidance document as we go through today, just familiarise yourself with the content of that and take it home for your bedtime reading. A couple of other things about the process for this webinar. If you have a question that you want to ask, we're going to do those at the end. But please do use the chat function, the Q&A function. So that's this one down here next to the chat function. Please don't put your questions in the chat function, pop them in the Q&A function. That just means that I've got one place to look for all of the questions that people want answered, and it just makes things a little bit easier and makes sure that if you've got a question, that's got the best chance of getting answered at this webinar. We do also have a lot of questions through already. So when it comes time for the question portion of this webinar, we're just going to start with the questions that have been already fed through. And there's a lot of consistency in the kind of things that people are interested in. So there's definitely a very good chance that your question will be answered. So I can see that the number of participants is sort of starting to slow down a little bit in terms of people coming through. So we might get underway. And to begin with, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about where the building product information requirements have come from. Many of you might be familiar with MB's building system reforms. This series of reforms has been going on since around about 2019, when we consulted on a discussion document that had a whole bunch of proposals for ways to lift the performance of the regulatory system and get better outcomes for the sector and for New Zealand. The building system reforms, the first phase of building system reforms, really focused on building products and building methods, and making sure that in particular new and innovative products and building methods had a really good chance of participating in the market here, of making sure that there was the right information, the right assurance around these products and methods for things like the building consent system. Other things that we have underway that are under the building system reforms is our occupational regulation reform and also the building consent system review. So the building product information regulations are one part of the reforms. They fell into the first phase of reforms that I referred to earlier, and we've been working on those for about 3 or 4 years now. So what are building product information requirements? The building product information requirements regulations come into force on the 11th of December this year. And essentially what the regulations require is that a minimum level of information about those building products is provided publicly. And it's important to note that the responsibility to provide that information falls on the manufacturers and the importers of the building product. Retailers and distributors, on the other hand, just need to make sure that that information is available for the products that they sell or distribute. And in terms of why we're introducing the building product information requirements, One of the things that we found early on in the building system reforms is that building owners, homeowners, and consumers want to have confidence that the building products they use and the buildings that they live in are safe and fit for purpose. But the quality of information on building products is really variable, and the lack of consistent, comprehensive building product information is leading to a number of issues. The first issue is that product information often lacks clear detail about performance and other important matters. And this can lead to situations where building products aren't appropriate for their intended use or won't perform as needed. The second issue that came through is around poor quality product information slows down the consent process, especially where testing information cannot be easily verified, or where the building consent authorities don't have the information they need to assess an application. And so essentially the way that we have designed these regulations is really to seek to achieve a bunch of different things. So first, we want to make sure that designers, builders, product manufacturers are able to be held accountable for the building products that they manufacture, select, or use. We also want there to be trusted and quality information about building products. We want to make sure that designers and builders choose products that meet the requirements of the building code, and we want to make sure that those products are installed correctly to reduce the risk of defects in building work. And finally, we want to make sure that the building consent authorities have the information they need to officially consent and inspect. So in terms of the timeframes for the building product information requirements, I mentioned that we initially started consulting on these back in in April 2019. This is the more recent timeline for the development of the regulations, which really started in 2021 at the same time that we were passing the Amendment Act that gave us the ability to make these regulations. So in April 2021, we issued a regulations discussion document and sought feedback on the specific proposals that are contained in the regulations that are now that have now been made. And we've also released a summary of submissions on those submissions that were received on that discussion document in around about November 2021. In June, that's when we passed the regulations. And there was an inbuilt 18-month transition period to enable people to do the work, to get up to speed with what the regulations required and make any changes necessary to their systems and processes. And as I've mentioned a couple of times now, the regulations are going to come into force on the 11th of December. So that's a little bit of information around how the regulations have come to be. I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who's going to take you through the next slide.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities with the regulations. There are a number of parties who are touched by these, and obviously those who have obligations under the regulations as well. If we start with MB, which obviously is us, MB is responsible for making sure that the regulations are successfully implemented. So that involves working with our key stakeholders and talking about how they'll be impacted, and to make sure they understand their responsibilities, what they need to do to comply, and how they can access education and information resources. And then MB's Chief Executive has powers under the Building Act to enforce the duties and obligations in the regulations. The building consent authorities, and I think there's probably a few of you here today, building consent authorities don't have any new responsibilities as a result of the regulations. Once they are in force, BCAs will need to check that the building work and the products used are compliant with the building code via the building consent process, just like we normally do. Where a consent application contains building information that doesn't appear to meet the new requirements in the regulations, you can still process the building consent application and you can still request further information. You're encouraged, however, to contact MB if you feel like the information doesn't meet requirements, so that we can have a look at that. Over time, we are expecting you should see fewer requests for information about building products due to that increased amount, plus the consistency of the information that's being provided about building products. And hopefully also see a reduction in the number of inspection failures or notices to fix to the requirements for information, such as scope of use and installation requirements being provided with the product information. For designers, same thing, no new responsibilities as a result of the regulations, but there are benefits in giving you access to consistent and more reliable product information about designated building products, including things like the scope of use, design requirements, and any installation information. It should help you make select the right product for the right job and be much more easily able to compare different products. Again, where you see there might be insufficient product information, or it doesn't look like it complies with the regulations, we encourage you to contact us so we can take a look at it. For tradespeople, similar, no new responsibilities under the regulations, but again, seeing the benefits of having reliable product information, good information about installation, much clearer, so that you're able to install those products as they're intended to be installed. And for consumers, again, no responsibilities, but we're hoping that this will allow consumers to make much clearer and well-informed decisions about the products that they're looking to use, being able to compare products and use them as they were intended to be used. For manufacturers and importers, wholesalers, retailers and distributors, these are the groups who have new responsibilities under the regulations. And in this webinar, we're going to go into more detail about those groups. And I'll hand over to Connor.
Cool, got it. Hey guys, so my name's Connor Topanen. I'm working in the design and implementation team on the implementation side of these regulations. So Amy mentioned earlier that we've got a detailed guidance document that we've released. So yeah, really recommend you guys have a look at that. Just highlighting it here because I'm going to work through the key steps to comply with these regulations, but go to that document and there'll be more detail on that. Cool. So the first step around the steps to comply is to consider which of the products you manufacture, sell, or intend to use are actually impacted by the regulations. So products which are covered are referred to as designated building products. In the regulations, you might see that term come up. And the regulations set the criteria that need to be met in order for a product to be impacted. So in order for it to be impacted, all of these things must apply. So it needs to be manufactured in or imported into New Zealand on or after the 11th of December. So that's when the regulations become enforceable. It also needs to be a new product, so can't be a used product. And you know, the regulations only apply to building products that, when used in building work, may affect whether the building work complies with the building code. There's also the last point, which it can't be exempt under Regulation 7 in the regulations. So this covers things like if the product has a code mark, if it's part of Built Ready or the old sort of MCM scheme, products that are temporary like scaffolding, they're not impacted. Frames and trusses, fully bespoke products. And also the last one is around any gas or electrical products. So they're not impacted by the regulations either. So once you know your product or your set of products are impacted, step 2 is around determining whether you or your organization meets the definition of what's called a responsible person. So that's not a generic term. The regulations define that, and there are 2 types of responsible person. So the first is manufacturers and importers, and the second group is the wholesalers, retailers, and distributors of building products. I think Amy might have mentioned that each of these groups have different responsibilities under the regulations. And it's important to note that in order to meet the definition, you or your company needs to be living or incorporated into New Zealand. Just at a high level, the responsibilities of each of these two groups. So the manufacturers and importers, they have a responsibility for collating and producing the required information and disclosing that online in a way that's free of charge to the public. The second group, the wholesalers, retailers, distributors, their responsibility is more around making sure that the information is available to anyone that they sell the product to. So importantly, the product can't be sold if that information isn't available. Step 3. So this is about determining whether you have a Class 1 or a Class 2 designated building product. The regulations set the criteria for what a Class 1 and Class 2 actually mean. I'll quickly run through that now. So a Class 1 product is one which is mass-produced or produced in batches. So that's the key thing here. It also needs to be available for wholesale or retail purchase. Again, needs to be new and not used. When used in building work, it may affect whether it complies with the building code. And similar to earlier, it can't be exempt under Regulation 7. So the key here, Class 1, think it's those mass-produced products or ones that are done in big batches. So some examples of a Class 1 product include cladding, mechanical fixings, insulation products, internal lining products. We've come up with a list in the guidance document. It's not exhaustive, but it'll give you a fair idea around what a Class 1 product is. In terms of a Class 2 product, the key here is that these products are based on a line of products where each unit has been customized to the specification of an individual client or a building. So that's the key difference here. Similar to a Class 1, though, it has to be new, can't be used. And when used in building works, it may affect whether the building complies with the building code, and also can't be exempt under Regulation 7. So some examples of a Class 2 product. External window joinery might be a Class 2. Doors and skylights, which are being customized to the specifications of a client. Also fire doors and windows, fire alarms, sprinkler systems, if they've been customized for an individual or to a building itself, then it's likely a Class 2. Cool. So step 4, this is about ensuring that the information requirements are being met. So this is really the bulk, the meat of the regulations here. So the regulations prescribe what, when, and how the information must be disclosed. And it also outlines the requirements for reviewing, updating, and maintaining the information. In the guidance document, we've split up the content for each responsible person as it's defined in the regulations. So step 4A, just to reiterate, this is the manufacturers and importers. So they're responsible for actually collating and producing the information and then making sure that's disclosed online. Schedule 1 of the regulations goes into all the detail, provides a full list of the information that must be disclosed. I won't cover everything here, but recommend you guys go and have a look at the regulations themselves, but also that guidance document. Based on our research, most manufacturers and importers will already have the majority of the required information about their building product. But the key thing here is it might not all be disclosed in one place or in a way that's like overly accessible. If you have a product technical statement or an appraisal of some sort, then yeah, you've likely already got the majority of that information. So I recommend you use that as a starting point and then go from there to see if you have any gaps rather than starting from scratch. Okay, so once you've got the information, well, then what? Well, so the regulations, they have requirements for not only what must be disclosed, but also how that information must be disclosed. So the key here is it must be published and maintained on a website and available free of charge. And there must also be no preconditions on access. So there's things like needing to create an account, insert a password, log in, add an email address, for example. Okay, so once the information's there, it's up on a website. Next step, how does a customer actually access it? Well, again, the regulations outline a number of options for doing this. So you'll need to make sure that the website where that information is published, it can either be disclosed on the building product itself. It could be on the packaging that the product comes in. If it's sold in a store with a merchant, could be on a label or on a product, on a sign next to the product. And then the regulations have this kind of other clause in there which says, any other similar way, so that the public has a clear link to that website and the product information. So yeah, really recommend as a manufacturer or importer, if you're selling through a merchant, recommend having a chat with them and confirming what sort of approach you're going to take around how that information is disclosed. Yeah. So last bit here, step 4B, as was split it up in the guidance. Just to reiterate, this is for the wholesalers, retailers, and distributors. So they're responsible for making sure the required information is available before the product is distributed or sold. We've talked to a number of merchants about how they're going to go about this. I mean, ideally, the product's probably on, the website is on the product itself, or on the packaging straight from the manufacturer. But again, it could be on a sign or a label, or on a sticker within the store. Key thing for this group, it's not your responsibility to actually provide the information and collate it all. That sits with the manufacturer. But in saying that, you can't sell the product if that information isn't there. So it's kind of like a second check. So that was quite a bit to cover. Very aware of that. So we have got a number of resources out there for you guys. Have a look at the Building Performance website. We've got a link there, and I think someone's hopefully chucked a link in the chat as well. So we've talked about the guidance document. Recommend you having a look at that. We've also got a blank template, which fully optional to use. But if you are starting from scratch or don't have the information somewhere already, you can use this to input your information into. So this is more aimed at the manufacturers or the importers. And we've also got 2 examples of what it actually looks like to provide or disclose this information. So one for a class 1, and then we've got another for a class 2 product. So that should give you a fair idea about maintenance requirements, how much detail to go into there. And then we've also got a checklist. So recently put this up on the list. So if you've already got an appraisal or a product technical statement, bring up this checklist that you can find on the website, bring up the information you've got, and you can do a bit of a gap analysis to see how you're doing. So that's it from me. Went into a bit of detail there, but check out the guidance for more information, and also on the website. I'm now going to hand over to Lisa. So Lisa talked earlier, she's in our building system assurance team, and she's going to talk a bit about the compliance and enforcement approach that MB will take.
Thanks, Connor. Before I do talk about that, I just thought it might be worth just wrapping up and sort of segueing from what Connor's been talking about. Probably now, as you've listened to what's been said, you'll know that probably some manufacturers and importers will have more work to do with their product information than others in order to meet the requirements of the regulations. And I suppose if we have a look at it in a sort of a plain English approach, what's really important when you're wanting to comply here is to make sure you're understanding your roles and responsibilities here. So again, the guidance document is helpful there. I'd suggest you consider as a first port of call which of your products are covered by these regulations and which are not. Obviously, some products are exempt under Regulation 7, so have a look at the guidance for more information about that. I think it's important to also consider, especially where you've got a lot of products, to consider where you might be able to group products on one disclosure, or where you may be supplying or selling products that are part of a system. Then I think it's important to look at the information you already have. Connor's already mentioned this, and because it's possible for those who have a lot of product information already, is that you're able to just build on that rather than having to create all of this from scratch. And that might be, as Connor said, you might have a product technical statement, even a technical data sheet, maybe a comprehensive technical manual or an appraisal. So use that and build on it. You might find with using our checklist and doing a gap analysis that you've got a lot of that information already, and then move into collating and publishing your disclosures. We'll be here, MB, continuing to provide education up to, but also after the 11th of December. And in order to realise the benefits of these regulations, it is important that those who are required to comply with the regulations do so, as well as providing ongoing education. The Building Act also provides a number of statutory tools to address non-compliance. We can't really comment on the specific approach that we take to compliance and enforcement, because it's something that is approached on a case-by-case basis. But we do, as I mentioned earlier, the Building Act does give MB's Chief Executive powers under the Building Act to enforce the duties and obligations in the regulations. So if we go to the next slide, Connor. Thank you. Would be able to issue a notice to take corrective action. There are infringement offences with fine, and it's also an offence to fail to comply with information requirements. So MB's role as a regulator, it's a decision around looking at what is the most appropriate tool to address the particular situation. So really the emphasis for us as the regulator is to ensure that we are notifying importers and manufacturers if their product information is not compliant, and that situation is promptly rectified. But going hand in hand of that, of course, is that we will continue to educate, and it might be appropriate to just sometimes be providing targeted education even after the 11th of December. We'll be monitoring and responding to complaints, and we in the BSA team, we have a small team of investigators who will support this work, as well as other complaints work that we also do around building products. Connor, can I just have the next slide? Thank you. It's also worth mentioning, some may not be aware that there is also an offence now in the Building Act around making false, misleading and unsubstantiated claims about building products. In the past, these types of complaints we would have referred to the Commerce Commission to be assessed under the Fair Trading Act, but that jurisdiction has now been passed to MB, and I suppose you could look at it that we have the team and the capability to work with building products, so it's appropriate that come to us. We also have now a power to compel information and documents to assist us when we're investigating complaints, and I think that's really important because it gives us the ability to dig in and find out what's going on where we need to. But I think it's really important for people to remember too that there are defences against non-compliance, both with the information requirements and that false and misleading claims offence, and that's under section 362 VD if you want to have a closer look at that. Thanks, Connor. And then the last thing I just want to reiterate here for you is just the areas that we can offer support and assistance, information and education. So obviously we have our website, and we also have our guidance document. There's a QR code there if you want to access it like that. We recommend that you subscribe to our website, so you can do that, building.govt.nz/subscribe, and then that gives you the opportunity going forward to tune into any information updates or changes in this area. So that's really helpful. But also you can reach out to us. So there's a team of us that sit behind the products at MB email address. So please reach out. We recommend firstly that you read the guidance. I think that's really important. But if you read the guidance and then you have some other questions that haven't been answered, please reach out to our team through products. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Connor. It's awesome to see so many questions in the chat. I think we've got about 41 of those at the moment. We have actually hopefully addressed many of those questions in this next section that just sort of details some of the very common questions that we've been getting through in the webinars that we have been leading to date. So I'm going to quickly run through some of those now. And in this section, we're going to be joined by Andrew V. Jones and Hayden Taylor, who are just going to help with answering some of those common questions. So the first one I'm going to kick over to Hayden. Hayden, why is there a requirement to disclose the manufacturer's details for imported products?
So for this one, the greater transparency of origin can help building product users to make informed decisions about building products. And disclosure of that information can also assist in the event that there's a product failure or building failure where that product importer has gone out of business and an investigation is actually required. We've got more information on that particular question on our website as well if people would like to go there and have a look.
Great, thank you, Hayden. And the next one is for Lisa. Is it possible to group products together and give them one beeper?
Yes, Amy, it is. So manufacturers and importers can consider having one set of building product information for multiple products. I suppose you could say grouping, or it's a line or range of products. And this can definitely be done for products that have perhaps a cosmetic difference, such as colour, but could be done where products are physically different, such as different thicknesses or different lengths. So I suggest have a look at pages 16 and 17 of our guidance document if you need further information on that.
Great, thanks, Lisa. This next one's for Connor. How do we approach beepers when we sell a system which is made up of individual components?
Yeah, so it's sufficient for the system or the product as a whole to have its own product information, so to have that beeper, rather than every individual product or component that makes that up to need its own set of information. So individual products that make up the system should be in the product, within the description of the beeper. But yeah, the responsibility sits with the manufacturer or the importer of the system as a whole to provide that information rather than the individual manufacturer of the components itself. But yeah, just worth noting, if the manufacturer's intention is, in addition to that component or product being used within a system, if that's going to be sold separately, or used separately, then that'll also need its own beeper or set of information.
Oh, thank you, Connor. Heading back to Hayden now, can a product be class 1 and class 2? And what do people do in that case?
So the intent behind this is not to require two sets of information disclosures for the same product. What manufacturers and importers need to do is basically produce one disclosure that best meets their use case. One thing that's probably worth noting here is that the information that's actually disclosed for class 1 and class 2 products is actually very similar, but a key difference is when it is disclosed. So for the mass-produced off-the-shelf type product, it's disclosed at the point of sale, prior to sale, whereas for the class 2 product, that information needs to be disclosed before the customized product based on a product line is ordered. But if people have a look at pages 12 to 13 of the guide, there's a bit more of a discussion there about the differences.
Oh, thank you, Hayden. This next one, I think I'm going to kick over to Lisa. Why are products with a watermark certification not exempt?
Okay, well, look, essentially, Watermark is an Australian certification scheme for plumbing products. So products with a watermark certificate are not assessed against the New Zealand Building Code. Whereas, for instance, some people say, well, why is Codemark exempt and Watermark not exempt? Codemark New Zealand products are certified to the New Zealand Building Code. So where you are manufacturing or importing plumbing products with watermark certification, you will need to provide a statement specifying the clauses of the New Zealand Building Code that are relevant to the product. And you'll also need to meet the other requirements and the regulations as well. So there's a little bit more information on page 17 of the guidance, but what I'd also recommend is if you're in that position, you could consider looking at our checklist and doing a gap analysis, so having a look at your watermark certification and just looking at what other information you would need to provide.
Cool. And Lisa, I think we're going to stick with you for the next question. Can a building consent authority reject the use of a product because it doesn't have a beeper?
No, that's not the intention of the regulations. So a BCO will still need to check that the building work and the products used are compliant with the building code as part of processing that building consent application. So you're also still able to request further information about those building products so it can better inform your decision about the building consent application. But where you feel that that information is deficient, you can certainly raise it with the importer or manufacturer. But where you can't resolve that issue, please reach out to products@nb.gov.nz, and that's the team where I work. Obviously, we can have a look at that. But I think for us, in a way, BCAs are a bit of the eyes and ears on the ground for us. So getting feedback helps us understand how this is going, how people are complying with the regulations, but obviously also it will help us ensure we're targeting education and looking at any enforcement action where that might be necessary.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Andrew, we're going to come to you next. What happens if the building product is intended to be used in multiple situations with different building code requirements?
Right. So if the product can reasonably be expected to be used in multiple situations where they affect different building code clauses, then the product will need to have information available for all the situations that are relevant to it. For some products, there might be some strong overlaps, and in some cases, maybe not so much. So, for example, a drainage pipe might help contribute to compliance with Clause E1 for stormwater and Clause G13 for foul water, and the requirements might be very similar, no matter which of those uses you use. But a sheet of plasterboard that can be used for a fire-rated wall, but also be used for bracing, it might have different nailing requirements or other things about its instructions that mean that the information has to be very clear on which parts of the information apply when it's used in one way and which apply in a different way.
Awesome, thank you, Andrew. Connor, we're going to come to you next. Do people need to archive information for discontinued products?
Yeah, so this links in with the reviewing, updating, and maintaining part of the regulations. So, as a product develops over time and new versions are supplied, manufacturers and importers should consider how they're going to manage that information to make sure it's up to date, but also that the information remains accessible for previous versions of that product, because they may still be within the supply chain and being used. So if a product is superseded or taken off the market, the manufacturer will need to consider how they communicate this with merchants and also manage that information in the future. The regulations don't actually prescribe any set timeframes for how long the information needs to be available. But in the guidance document, we've recommended keeping it up to date, keeping it there and available for a period of about 10 years. So it seems like a long time, but it aligns with the implied warranties, which are outlined in the Building Act. In terms of the website side of things, you could have an archive tab or a section on the website, which may be useful for a consumer.
Oh, thanks, Connor. Back to you, Hayden. Why wasn't embodied carbon considered when making these regulations?
Yeah, so the building product disclosure requirements are based on the current building code. So that does include the current H1 energy efficiency provisions, but so changes to regulations would be needed to include things like embodied carbon, and that would depend on future policy work.
Oh, thanks, Hayden. Connor, I think you've got the next question here, which is really around, if someone's already got a brands appraisal or a product technical statement, what happens then?
So I think we've touched on this a couple of times, but yeah, like an appraisal or a certification might provide people with confidence about a building product or a system. But it doesn't necessarily mean the product's automatically exempt from the regulations. So refer to Regulation 7, that's got a full list of exemptions. But yeah, if you've got a PTS or an appraisal, get up the MB checklist and use that to see if you've got any gaps there.
Oh, thanks, Connor. And Lisa, coming back to you for the next one. Temporary products, permanent products, what's the difference in the requirements?
Okay, well, that's an important question because under Regulation 7, it exempts products that are of a temporary nature. So where you think a building product might be temporary in nature, have a think about the rule of thumb is that if the product does not form part of the building when the construction is completed, then it can be considered a temporary product and is exempt. So again, have a wee look at the guidance. There's just a little bit more information and a few examples of what could be considered a temporary product there.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And just lastly on the common questions, back to you, Andrew. Raw materials versus a final product. What did the building product information requirements apply to and when?
Right. So the requirements apply to products when they've essentially been processed to the extent necessary that they could reasonably be expected to be used as a component of a building. So the regulations talk about relevant considerations for if it's a building product. They include matters such as the purposes for which it is ordinarily used, purposes for which it's intended by the supplier or manufacturer to be used, purposes for which it's represented or stated as saying it can be used, and for which it's likely to be used. So a couple of examples: a sheet of corrugated iron could probably be reasonably expected to be used as a component of a building. A shipload of iron ore is not likely to be used as a component of a building, or an ingot of bulk metal. Similarly, a length of structurally graded, preservative treated timber probably can be reasonably expected to be used as a component of a building, but an unprocessed log or a drum of preservative chemicals probably can't be expected to be a component of a building.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. All right, we're going to go through to the questions that have been asked in the Q&A function. Again, thank you so much for sending these through. I'm going to start at the top and we're going to see how we get on in the 15 minutes remaining. So please do bear with us. And as I say, if we don't get to your question today, please go and check out the guidance document and we'll pop some contact details up on the last slide for you to send any questions through to us if you can't find the answer in the guidance document. So there's a question here around, again, products that look like they're part of a system. So drainage channels relates to the building code E1 and E2, but the grade itself doesn't. will the information need to include information about the grate as well? I'm going to chuck this over to, let me think, maybe Connor?
Yeah. Yeah, so we touched on systems before. So the intent is that the system as a whole just needs to have the beeper information, but there will be individual components that make up that system. So if they're not going to be sold individually, just list them on within the information. But if they are going to be sold individually, if the intention is that they could be, then they will also need their own product information. So it's about, yeah, having as much information for the consumer as possible.
Yeah. And maybe just sticking with you, I think that we've spoke about this a little bit in the webinar, but if you've got a couple of different suppliers for a product, like say one that's here in New Zealand and one that's overseas, which one do you list?
Yeah, so they have to be living or incorporated in New Zealand for them to actually be covered by the regulations. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Connor. The next question's around importing products from overseas that are then sold on to a manufacturer or a fabricator who then fabricates the product for use in a building. So in that kind of situation, is a beeper required? Hayden, do you want to take this one maybe?
I think this might relate to the answer Andrew just gave to that last common question. It kind of depends on what that raw product or raw material can be reasonably expected to be used for. So like a barrel of chemicals on its own, probably not subject to this, but when it's used to treat some timber, that end thing is a building product. So it kind of depends on the circumstance there. Like a generic roll plate of steel, maybe not, but some steel products that are intended to be sold as building products and used in building work, and then they could be. It really it kind of depends on that intent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Hayden. This next question's around consumer confidence in the building product information requirements. So who's going to ensure that the information is accurate and can be trusted? And how will building product information requirements prevent the type of problems that are now apparent in the UK with the RAAC? I think that's the concrete products. Lisa, do you want to take this one?
Yes, thanks. I mean, obviously with the regulations, the onus lies on the importer and or manufacturer to ensure their information is accurate. And I guess you could argue that it is in your best interests to make sure that is the case. And I suppose if you're looking at someone who's specifying products, they're going to be wanting that information to be clear and comprehensive and meeting requirements. So I suppose that's important. There's an onus, but also a best interest. Obviously backing that up is MB, who will be responsible for monitoring and enforcing these requirements where necessary. But I suppose also just remembering that new section in the Building Act around false, misleading and unsubstantiated claims, that has a very strong consumer focus. So obviously we'll be looking at that closely as well. It's very important for people to feel that that information is accurate and and any claims that are being made can be substantiated. I apologise, I'm not familiar with the RAAC situation in the UK.
Awesome, thanks, Lisa. The next question's around what is the definition of a product identifier? Is this a statement on the product technical statement that describes the product, or is it some kind of mark on the product itself that enables it to be identified? Connor or Hayden, do one of you two want to take this one?
Yep. So the intent here is that it's something that can distinguish it from another product. So it could literally just be the name of the product if it's unique from others. Yeah, that's the main intent. Is that right, Hayden? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah.
But I mean, people may choose to use more specific identifiers. They could use QR codes or things like that. But it's really just to, as Connor said, distinguish the product from another product. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. All right. We've got a couple for Andrew now. The first one's around difficulties in obtaining the physical properties of products, which affects some aspects of the E3 clause of the building code. Will such parameters as vapor resistivity become more available?
Yeah, this is a bit of a tricky one. It does come down to what the product how it could reasonably be expected to contribute to compliance with the building codes. Now, the question was included mention of modelling of the building, which is one way of achieving compliance, but it's perhaps not the most common way, and there are other ways for perhaps simpler buildings and acceptable solutions. So a product where the manufacturer could reasonably be expected to think someone might decide to use my product and try and comply with clause E3 because of the properties of my product, we would expect them to disclose the relevant properties, which include vapor transmittance, and that would certainly be relevant for something like a wall underlay. On the other hand, someone achieving E3 compliance in a way that's a bit unusual, involves thermal modelling and is not an acceptable solution. They may be using products in a way that's not necessarily what the manufacturer intended, and therefore would be a bit unusual to, for the manufacturer. It'd be unusual to be able to say that the manufacturer could reasonably be expected to understand that situation and provide information.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. And I'm just sticking with you as well for the next question. What if products are made with recycled products? Some products will use things like recycled rubber, for example, which is no longer new.
Essentially, it's the product that is produced, whether that is new or used. If it's been in a building before, it's clearly used. If it's just come off a factory, even if what went into the factory was recycled, then it's probably new.
Right, so it's just the final product that comes out of all that manufacture, right?
That's right.
All right. Lisa, coming over to you, this is a question which is about plumbing products, but I suppose could apply to anything. If via the building product information requirements, there is a discovery that, in fact, the product is not compliant with the building code, what real-time action is possible to immediately discontinue use of that product until compliance is proven?
There's a couple of things in that question. And obviously we would want to know about it. So again, products at mb.gov.nz. The building system assurance team are responsible for looking at warnings and bans for building products. And so, I think we would want to hear about that, because we can have a look at that with the potential to issue a product ban if that meets the requirements for that. That's under Section 26 of the Building Act. There are also part of MB, we have a product safety team as well who manage recalls as well. So that's another area that we would be wanting to look at pretty quickly. There are can be voluntary recalls as well as compulsory product recalls. So I'm looking for preferably a voluntary recall where it meets those requirements, and remediation of those products as well. So they're the kinds of things we would want to look at, but absolutely that's something that is definitely falls into the area of the team I work in.
Thanks, Lisa. Then there's questions around electrical products being exempt, and does this extend to all things electrical? So HVAC systems, fire alarms, that sort of thing. Does one of our panel want to pick this one up? Maybe you, Hayden.
Yeah, so under Regulation 7, there is an exemption for all electrical and gas appliances and fittings as defined under the Gas and Electricity Acts. So I think our guide has a little bit more information on that, but so pretty much anything that's already covered by those two pieces of legislation, they're not covered by these requirements.
In terms of the disclosure requirements, there's a question here where somebody imports and sells a Class 2 building product and doesn't have a New Zealand website, and the Australian and Swiss manufacturers don't want to add this New Zealand document to their website. So what's the potential way that this person can comply in this situation? Connor, do you have any ideas on that front?
Yeah, well, I mean, there does need to be a website somewhere, so that information does need to be disclosed online. So I guess an option is setting up a website based in New Zealand, where you could link through to, just for those products. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Connor. Andrew, kicking it back to you with this question, what about generic products like timber framing or timber bevelback weatherboards? Are they all expected to have product information available even though they are covered as generic under the building code in 3604?
The short answer is yes, they do need building product information requirements, at least unless they meet any of the exemptions. The compliance with the standard is a very good place to start in explaining why it complies with the building code.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. Here's a good question. If products are sold over the phone or via an email order and delivered direct to site, do we have to have our customer service agents tell customers where to access the declarations before they're allowed to take orders? Maybe Connor, is this one for you?
Yeah, so we've had this one in the past, and the recommendation is, if it's the order's made over the phone, if you send out a quote to them and have it all priced up as a part of your standard business, I think that would probably be quite a good place to have a link to where the information is, so that they could double check that, yep, this is the right product. Have a looking, at that information. So you're probably on the quote of the product as an option.
And just similarly here, like what about products where it's only seen in its packaging by the tradespeople, and might be taken out of the packaging in order to put on shelves or something along those lines? What are the options for people in that sort of situation?
So is this from a retailer perspective, or do we still need a?
So this is from the product manufacturer perspective, I think.
Right.
How do they make sure that they get their information? How do they make sure that they get their information across, all the required information, to the consumer when they're not necessarily seeing it on the packaging?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I guess the website is on the product itself, or on the packaging. Yeah, the regulations kind of have that clause at the end which says in any other way. So yeah, without having known the actual supply chain and how it's working, kind of hard to comment, but unless someone else has an idea on the panel.
Thanks, Connor.
Yep.
I'm going to kick one back to Lisa. This is about compliance and enforcement. Someone's here has asked if people do miss things regarding any specific information, what's going to happen first is is if MB issues some kind of notice to correct, is there going to be some kind of grace period before a fine is issued?
No, no. I mean, we don't talk. I can't talk in terms of a grace period. Again, it comes back to approaching each scenario case by case and looking at the circumstances of the situation. It could be just some targeted education if it's something small that's been overlooked. It could be. that we might choose to just target some education, or also, again, use that notice to take corrective action. So issue a notice just directing the importer or manufacturer to, to draw their attention to the area that we feel isn't compliant, and having them address that in a time frame.
Right, thank you. I've just noticed that there's a couple of questions around, are building consent authorities able to not accept a building consent application where there's no building product information requirement in place? Did you maybe just want to reinforce that point that you made in the webinar, Lisa, about that?
Yes, the regulations are not intending for you to have that as a ground to reject a building consent application. You're still, assessing that application under the normal reasonable grounds. I think for you would just be, you may need to request further information if you're not finding the information is sufficient. And also, if you do feel it's seriously deficient, reaching out to MB through our products at mb.gov.nz.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Look, we are out of time. I've done a very poor job at keeping to time here, so I am going to wrap it up. There are quite a few questions in the Q&A function about requesting access to this recording. We're going to make that available on our website after this in the next few days, so do look out for that. Please share it among your networks. We really want to get the word out far and wide about the building product information requirements coming into force later this year. We would really love your help in order to do that. Connor, I think, is there one more slide that gives people the necessary links to our website, our guidance document, further information, and again, just reinforcing that if you do have a specific question, if it hasn't been answered here in the webinar, if it's not in the guidance document, then there is that products@mb.gov.nz. Bear in mind, there's quite a lot of people who have questions about the new requirements. They're coming into force pretty soon. Please bear with us while we, make sure that we get back to you with a good answer if you do come through to that email address. But look, it just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time to come and listen about the building product information requirements. Please do go check out our guidance, and if you have any feedback on that, get in touch with us, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Ka kite.
Thank you. Bye.